Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I saw that Dr. Brad Schoenfeld way earlier this morning announced his newest meta-analysis that he took part in, and I think that's pretty relevant for all of us here in the training world. Anyone who's trying to gain muscle mass at all, I think the findings on this are pretty interesting and useful to you. Because they give us an actual really good, reasonable scientific consensus on the topic of training frequency and muscle growth. So let me throw on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little crafting, and let's talk about this. All right, now for people who don't know what a meta-analysis is, meta-analysis is not a study. All right, a lot of people get that confused. A study is where you take a bunch of test subjects and control variables and you test something and try to draw conclusions from it. A meta-analysis is where you take a group of scientists who try to look at every study that's ever been done on a topic. Whether it's 5 studies, 20 studies, or 150 studies that have been done on a topic. And they analyze all the data, they look for a trend in the data, and if they find studies that contradict each other, they try to find out why they contradict each other. Come to reasonable explanations so that they can get a real idea of what's going on. They actually have to look at the variables and do some what they call multivariate analysis and try to figure out why in the heck 3 studies show one thing and 2 studies show something that seems to contradict it. They need to figure out why. And in this case, what Dr. Brad, or as I like to call him Dr. Gaines, because his PhD is in muscle gains. That's what he specializes in. He concluded that they know for a fact, based upon the meta-analysis, and we've known this actually for 20 years, maybe 25 years. And when I say we, I mean the human race, people who actually read science. Doesn't mean that we all participated in the specific studies. Just because people get mad when I say that, I'm clarifying that point. It means those of us who are actually scientifically literate and can read. That's we. So, that being said, we have known for a couple of generations now that training a muscle multiple times a week produces faster muscle gains in every single human being. When it's studied in a lab, and every person across the board, irrespective of genetics, more than training it once a week, if they're not on drugs, produces superior results, not equal, superior results always, every time. But what he wanted to look at was to actually look at that and kind of prove that with the data. And what they found is that, yeah, it's conclusive. Looking at the studies across the board, that training a muscle twice a week causes noticeably, measurably more muscle gains than training it once a week. All right, pretty much accepted. What they concluded was that they can't tell yet if training more than twice a week has a conclusive improvement on increasing muscle gains. Now, a lot of people are going to say, Jason, you always say that you have people training everything 3 times a week on most programs, full body 3 times a week, although some of mine now are twice a week. Notice I do have a mixture of the 2 in the programs I put out for free. But the programs I'm putting out for free with the twice a week still fall under what this study would say is pretty good. So that being said, we know that. Why do I recommend 3? Well, because what some previous studies have determined is that if some people gain maximally at twice a week, and some people don't gain any faster if they go beyond twice, and they found a few rare individuals out there genetically who seem to gain fastest. They train a muscle up to 5 times a week. So it is inconclusive. It's still hard to tell because there's probably a strong genetic component, and we don't have good enough numbers to know who's going to benefit from that or not yet. And I think because it ranges from 2 up to 5, with 3 being closer to the average, because a lot more people do reach maximal growth on twice a week than people who reach it on 5. 5 seem to be in the studies I saw many, many years ago. People say, why don't you link that? I can't find it. It's something I read in a university library before we had studies on the internet. So I have no idea how to even find some of that now. It was stuff I found in physiology textbooks that I then went to the library and looked up that were listed in the references in a book, textbook. So that's where I found it. I don't even have that textbook anymore. So, but there were some that showed up to 5. But the point is, 3 is a nice solid number to go with. But as long as you're training them at least twice, you should be good in terms of frequency. Now, the other thing there is, of course, that strength is a different factor. We have found, and definitely have been studies that have shown improvements on 1 rep maxes on strength by training them up to 5 or 6 times a week. Particularly, your lifts that you want to get strongest on for a max. And that's different because there's not just muscle growth to consider. There is also a neurological and a motor unit component and a speed strength component. Whereas in this other study, just looking at muscle growth. And it's not to say that muscle growth isn't correlated with strength, because it is. But they're just looking at muscle growth, not peak strength, hitting a 1 rep max on your bench or your deadlift. Okay, a little bit of difference there. Now, a lot of people are also going to go, well, if that's true, then how come so many pro bodybuilders get away with once a week? Well, brutal honesty, because training matters very, very little when you start using high amounts of drugs. That's a simple reality. And I'll go so far as to say, since we know from studies that people on moderate amounts of anabolics gain muscle faster sitting on their ass than people who train and lift weights, that is a scientifically verified fact. And I've linked studies showing that more than once. They're not that hard to find. But yeah, people on 500-600 milligrams of testosterone in a lab who sit on their ass and do nothing gain muscle at twice the rate that people who lift weights do without drugs. And I don't mean guys who didn't lift. I'm talking guys who quit lifting continue to gain muscle. That's what the studies show. So when you go to pro bodybuilder type doses, since we know the higher your drug doses go, the more your training is devalued, the less it matters for your muscle growth. It might be an almost reasonable conclusion to say most pro bodybuilders, with the doses they use in their genetics, would be massive if they sat on their ass and the heaviest thing they lifted was a steak or a plate of pork to their mouth. Maybe drank a protein shake. If that's the heaviest thing they ever picked up was some food, maybe got up to shit every now and then, got out of their bed to go take a crap, maybe go to the kitchen every now and then. If that's the most exercise they did, most of them would still probably be massive. They would be a lot bigger than any natural walking around out there if they were completely sedentary. I think that's a fair statement based upon the data that we have available. Given the doses a lot of them use, and again, their genetic predisposition towards gaining muscle mass. So I think it's almost fair to say that some of those guys, it doesn't matter how they train. It might not even matter if they train. And now that's a big blow to the bodybuilding world with all of that, because these guys want to sell seminars and training and everything else. And it's like, when you're on 3 grams of gear plus growth hormone and IGF-1, do you honestly think it makes a fuck what you do in the gym? You're going to be massive no matter what. As long as you get enough food and enough sleep, you're going to look like a comic book character. You don't have to know anything about training. You don't even have to train hard. You might not even have to train at all. That's what we haven't concluded yet, if they actually have to lift weights. We don't know yet. But that's something to think about there. So when people say, how come they get massive on training a muscle once a week? Well, we could speculate other factors in there too regarding frequency versus volume and muscle protein synthesis. But the truth is, we know that steroids stack slabs of muscle on you when you're laying in a bed doing nothing. So I don't know. How about because they use a ton of drugs? There's your answer. Doesn't matter how they train. But we're talking about people on no drugs. That's what these studies are looking at. And the data is pretty well conclusive at this point. We know this is a fair statement. This is a conclusion because the other is still up to some debate. But what we do know is that training a muscle at least twice a week produces significantly more muscle growth than training it once. And there's pretty good scientific consensus at this point. And again, people want to argue, well, scientists don't know everything. No, they don't. That's why they do studies. That's why they put people in labs and actually make them lift weights where they can document it and see what they actually do, so they can't lie about it. And then they take DEXA scans and actually measure with computers how much muscle they gained. That's why we have studies like that. And if you don't think that that's more accurate than anyone's anecdote, well, I trained 6 or 7 people. Well, did you measure them with DEXA scans? Did you write it all down and document it and document their lifestyle and measure it with a DEXA scan to actually make sure that they gained more muscle than the guys doing the other type of training? And if you didn't, then how can you argue that your anecdote is equal value to studies that do all of that? You can't. It's just silly at that point. That's why we measure these things. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.